The wind howled through the trees, bending their limbs as if they, too, had heard the whispers from beyond the grave. The chapel at the cross stood, silent but watchful, along Highway 16 in Madison County, Mississippi, its Gothic spires cutting into the dusky sky like the fingers of some forgotten deity. The light of day was fading, but there was something about the chapel, something eternal about its presence, that made the night seem as if it had been waiting patiently for centuries. It had been 1852 when Mrs. Margaret Johnston first envisioned the chapel, a woman with determination in her eyes and sorrow buried deep in her heart. She had sought to create something more than just a church. This was to be a monument, a place of reverence not only for the living, but for the dead too, an eternal tribute to the man she loved, who now rested beneath the weight of the earth. Her husband, Jonathan, had passed in the most tragic way possible. A disease that swept through their home had taken him in his prime, and Mrs. Johnston's grief was so powerful it nearly broke her. The chapel became her salvation, a way to keep him close. Every stone was laid with care, every beam placed with thought. She spared no expense on the stained glass windows, the altar, or the communion rail. But the most incredible feature was a pipe organ, a gift from her homeland, a treasure from a forgotten time. It was said that when the organ played, it could summon the spirits of the past, those who had been lost to time. Construction dragged on for years. The walls rose slowly, inch by inch, as if even the earth was reluctant to house the chapel's haunting beauty. By the time it was completed in 1855, the air surrounding the place was thick with secrets, as if the chapel had been there long before the first stone had been placed. Mrs. Johnston never lived to see the chapel flourish in its full glory. She died unexpectedly in 1860, leaving behind only the memory of her love and a structure that would become something far darker than she had ever intended. And so the chapel, isolated and distant, stood as a silent sentinel to the secrets that gathered in its shadow. The chapel was not only a resting place for the living, it had become a sanctuary for the dead. By the time the full moon rose, the gates were locked tight, the doors secured, and silence would descend upon the chapel like a thick blanket, suffocating the land. But if one listened closely, truly listened, they would hear something more than the eerie quiet. By the grave of Henry Vick, a figure stood. She was young, her face hidden in the shadows, her body cloaked in grief. The wails were faint at first, a soft sobbing, like a whisper carried on the wind. But as one drew closer, the sobs grew louder, more desperate. The woman's mourning became unmistakable. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the sound would vanish. The woman would be gone. It was said that she was no stranger to the chapel. Her name, too, had been lost to time, an echo in the halls of the living. But her story had been passed down like a curse. She was the daughter of Mrs. Johnston, a young girl who had fallen in love with Henry Vick, a man whose charm had swept her off her feet. They were engaged to be married, their love a beacon of joy that shone through the darkest of days. But fate is a cruel mistress. Henry was killed in a duel mere days before the wedding. The love that had burned so brightly was snuffed out in an instant. The grief of the young woman was unbearable. She would not leave his side. For days she lingered at his grave, crying and calling out to him as if the earth could somehow bring him back to life. Months passed, and the girl, overcome with grief, finally left the chapel and traveled to Europe, hoping that time would heal her broken heart. When she returned, she had married a minister, but her heart was never whole again. Her love for Henry had been too deep, too strong to ever fade. And so, it is believed that her spirit remains by his grave, mourning the loss of the man she would never marry. Those who come too close, those who dare to cross the threshold of the graveyard, are said to hear her wails, her cries for the love that was never realized. And just as quickly as she appears, she vanishes, as if the wind itself had claimed her. Late at night, when the air was still and the moon hung low over the chapel, strange things began to happen. Those who had visited the chapel at dusk and left with the setting sun returned to find something unsettling, a haunting presence, a chill that gripped their bones, and the unmistakable sound of music. It was faint at first, a note here, a chord there, but it grew louder, richer, more distinct. The pipe organ, the same one Mrs. Johnston had so carefully placed in the chapel, would play. But the doors were locked, the windows were shut, No one was there. The music filled the empty space, a mournful melody that seemed to rise on the very walls of the chapel itself. It was as if the organ had a life of its own, its pipes resonating with an energy beyond human comprehension. The air seemed to hum with the notes, as if the music had the power to tear at the fabric of reality itself. But when the visitors rushed to unlock the doors to discover the source of the music, they found nothing. No one was there. The organ, still and silent, awaited the next night, when it would play again without hands, without a soul to guide it. Rumors spread quickly. It was the ghost of Mrs. Johnston herself, guiding the organ from beyond the grave. Or perhaps it was the spirit of her husband, Jonathan, who was still tethered to the chapel, seeking a way to communicate with the living. But others spoke of something darker, something far more sinister. The caretaker's story was one of darkness, of madness, and of violence. His name, too, was lost to time, but the horrors of his life were whispered in the corners of the chapel's graveyard. It was said that he had once lived in the small cottage that sat beside the chapel, caring for the grounds and looking after the property. But something inside him had snapped, something deep and unforgiving. The caretaker had a wife, a woman who had been unwell, mentally unstable. Some said she was prone to fits of madness, and her instability had driven the caretaker to the edge. One fateful night, in the grip of rage and confusion, the caretaker twisted her neck and severed her head. He had cleaned up the mess, but it was clear he had lost control. He tried to bury the horrors of that night, but they had followed him. Every day, he would wander grounds, his mind unraveling bit by bit. Eventually, in his madness, he ended his own life, hanging himself in the chapel's rafters. It is said that on quiet nights, when the wind howls and the chapel is still, the caretaker's ghost can be seen wandering the grounds, his body swaying in the wind as if still hanging from the rafters. But it is not just his presence that unsettles those who visit. At times, blood would appear on the stone floors of the chapel, dark red stains that seemed to materialize from nowhere, only to vanish by morning. It was as if the past refused to stay buried. The chapel of the cross was not just a place of prayer. It had become a place of torment, a site where the living and the dead coexisted in a strange, unsettling harmony. The spirits that lingered there were not at rest, not content to fade into the past. They clung to the chapel, to the earth, to the memories that had bound them to that place. And yet, those who came to pray, to seek solace, were never truly alone. They could feel the eyes of the lost upon them, could hear the faintest whispers carried on the wind. The organ, still and silent during the day, would awaken in the dead of night. It was as if the chapel itself was alive. Its walls, its stones, its very foundation alive with the presence of those who had passed. And it was not just the ghosts of the past who haunted the chapel. There were others, dark figures, shadowy presences, seen only out of the corner of one's eye. They would flicker in and out of existence, like fleeting thoughts that could not be held. But their presence was unmistakable. They watched, they waited. As the clock struck 6 every evening, the gates of the chapel and the graveyard would close. The chapel's doors would lock, and the living would retreat, leaving the dead to claim the night. The spirits that had gathered there, the lost souls that had once walked among the living, were given dominion over the chapel's hallowed grounds. The moon would rise higher, and the chapel would stand silent but ever watchful. The ghosts, those who had once been human, would rise and take their place. The sobbing woman by Henry Vick's grave, the unseen hands that played the organ, the caretaker whose blood-stained footsteps wandered the grounds. It was their time now, and the living would never know the true horrors that awaited them behind the locked doors. Because in the twilight hours, the chapel belonged to the dead, and they were not ready to rest.